while high tide is at 7 o'clock this evening.
On air and online, you're listening to Radio Orkney this Friday morning, and right now the time is exactly 23 minutes to 8.
Now, as we heard in the news, the Scottish Government's consultation into proposals to establish highly protected marine areas, or HPMAs, ends on Monday. There's been growing controversy around the plans this week, so what is all the fuss about? Joining us now live on the line is someone who knows Orkney's marine environment very well. Michael Kaiser is Professor of Fisheries Conservation at Heriot-Watt University, and he was on the independent committee which backed the introduction of HPMAs in UK waters almost 3 years ago. Good morning, Professor Kaiser.
Good morning to you.
Now, Professor Kaiser, you backed the idea of HPMAs a few years ago now. What's different about the Scottish Government proposals compared to south of the border?
So first of all, I would say I'd use the word backed, actually. So the UK government convened a committee that was chaired by Richard Benyon, and we were asked to look at the criteria by which highly protected marine areas would be introduced, and more importantly, what the objectives of those HPMAs would actually be. And just to be clear, the committee was not asked to actually identify areas where they'd be introduced. What's happened in the UK basically is the UK government is sort of advancing with its plans for HPMAs quite cautiously, with a few areas proposed initially. And interestingly, the Lindisfarne proposed area was actually withdrawn as a result of considerable social protest because of the close link between the fishing community and the impact the proposed HPMA would have on that community. As far as I'm aware, in terms of the Scottish government has come out with this 10% target, which is quite different to elsewhere in the UK. I'm not sure why they've defined 10% as a particular target, but clearly they have. And so it needs to be seen whether that is indeed what they want to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, here in Orkney, we already have marine protected areas, and as you say, the Scottish Government hasn't announced where the HPMAs will be anyway. Is there anything to be concerned about?
I think there are a considerable number of concerns in terms of implementation of HPMAs, but just to think about the difference between HPMAs and what we currently have in the UK and in Scotland. So we have a considerable diversity of different types of marine protected areas, many of which are specifically designed to protect individual species or particular types of habitats. So, for example, some marine protected areas in Wales, for example, are specifically designed to protect bottlenose dolphins. And actually within those marine protected areas, it's not the fishing industry that's the problem, it's actually tourism activities like jet skiers that are the problem and need to be managed to protect bottlenose dolphins in that case. So I think the main concern will be where the consideration is to introduce a highly protected marine area. That inevitably will result in the removal of extractive activities. So fishing, for example, potentially aquaculture, aggregate extraction. It's highly unlikely that you're going to have a wind farm or renewables within those areas, and any activity that is deemed to sort of interfere in a way that could be deleterious to it. Now, if that HPMA is introduced in an area where local rural economies highly depend on that area for their living, then clearly there's going to be a major economic and social impact in the local area. So considerations about where to put the HPMAs need to take into account those local, social and economic considerations.
What would be the right level of protection, in your opinion?
It depends on what you're trying to achieve, ultimately. What we do know from studies around the globe is that where we have partially protected areas, these perform well, but they don't perform as well as what are sometimes called no-take zone, or in this case, highly protected marine areas. So this really is a tool where we want to see what nature would be like without any interference from human activity. But it's important always to remember, of course, that there are some things that HPMAs cannot protect the marine environment from. So, for example, things like pollution in the surrounding waters, increasing water temperature from climate change. The only thing your HPMA can potentially protect from are human activities. But of course, all of that is irrelevant unless we have appropriate enforcement. And without enforcement, and that means enforcement on all activities, then they're not likely to achieve their outcomes and intended aims.
Now, just very briefly, Professor Kaiser, campaign group Open Seas are calling for low-impact forms of fishing, like scallop diving and creel fishing, which are quite common here in Orkney, to be treated differently to trawling and dredging and the like. That would seem sensible.
That's interesting that they've taken that stance, because that seems to be quite a rowback from their normal position, and would actually be contrary to what the aims and objectives of an HPMA would be. An HPMA would actually dictate that all extractive activities are removed from those areas. So clearly, if sort of fishing activities are affected, there will be economic consequences. And as I said, that's why I think very careful consultation needs to be undertaken. And I personally would like to see local communities, particularly in rural areas, much more involved in the decision-making process about where HPMAs might be appropriate and may benefit those local communities, because there are benefits that local people could potentially realise from having an area that was protected from other activities, which might negatively impact on things like fishing and aquaculture, for example.
Well, thank you very much this morning for joining us this morning, Professor Kaiser. I will leave it there, and we'll see what happens with the HPMAs following the consultation. Thank you very much.